All right. Good morning, everybody, or whatever time you're watching us. Good morning, good afternoon. It's morning for me. So this is going to serve as our replacement lecture for Friday, January 23rd. I canceled class today. Hopefully you guys all saw that email. I canceled class today just so that everybody had a chance to get home. Our class technically would have been happening today because it started before noon. But I know a lot of people were really anxious to get home and get to where they were going. So I went ahead and canceled class. So this is our replacement lecture for today's lecture for Friday, January 23rd. And so we are going to pick up right where we left off. We were in the middle of chapter 11. We were going through the four stages of bacterial pathogenesis. So we got through step 1, which was exposure. Step 2 is adhesion. Step 3, which we called, I'm trying to remember which word I used. Sorry, I think invasion. Step 3, surviving host defenses. And then step 4 was causing disease. And now I wanted to just talk about, this also goes along with step 4, causing disease, which are these words, signs and symptoms of disease. Now, this is another case where these are words that we use all of the time in our normal life, right? Like you hear the word symptom all the time. We talk about symptoms of disease, and your doctor will ask you what your symptoms have been, things like that. And we use that word symptom a lot, but we actually, a lot of us use it kind of incorrectly when we are talking about illnesses. And so these are the correct definitions of these words. I am completely aware, I do it too, that we use these words incorrectly sometimes. But for the purposes of this class, you do have to remember what these words specifically mean. So before anything else, a disease. What is a disease? We haven't defined that yet. So a disease is any condition in which the normal structure or functions of the body are damaged or impaired. This can be due to a bacteria, virus, genetics, environment, all kinds of different things, right? You can have genetic diseases. You can have allergies, which are a type of disease. You can have mental diseases, right? It's any condition where normal or typical structure or functions of the body are damaged or impaired. Now, in this class specifically, we are talking about infectious diseases, which are diseases caused by organisms, specifically microorganisms. But the term disease in general just means any condition, right? In this class, we're talking about infectious diseases, which are diseases caused by organisms. But again, the term disease, and when we're talking about signs and symptoms, that does apply to any type of disease, not just infectious ones. So a sign of a disease as compared to a symptom, a sign is something that happens to the body, some type of change or alteration of body structure or function that is measurable and or observable. Now, the key there is measurable and or observable. A lot of these signs will be things that you can see, but a lot of them will be things that are just measurable. So what I mean by that are things like vital signs. So vital signs are your body's reactions to the world around you, right? So something like vital signs would be like your pulse, right? A lot of diseases, when you are infected with something, your heart rate will go up. Your heart literally beats faster. Your pulse will be increased. That is something that somebody else can observe or measure, right? A doctor can look at you, put their hand on your wrist, and measure how many times per minute your heart is beating. This can also be things like a temperature, right? When your body is sick, a lot of times it produces a fever. Now, a fever isn't really something that somebody can see or observe, but it is absolutely something that somebody else can measure. Another way of thinking about signs is they are objective, right? Somebody else can look at you or measure something in you and be able to observe those changes, right? This isn't something that can be faked. And it's something that is objective. It is measurable. You can put a number to it. This can also be like blood chemistries. So I know a lot of you haven't really taken a whole lot of, some of you may have taken A&P, some of you may not have taken anything like that, but there are certain compounds that you can measure inside of a person's blood. Like if you've ever been to the doctor and they draw your blood for testing and they say, oh, well, your white blood cell count is up. A high white blood cell count is a sign of an infection, which will make more sense when we talk about the immune system. Or, if you're talking about like diabetes, right? Diabetes is a disease. A measurable sign of diabetes is increased blood sugar. So you draw somebody's blood and check the amount of sugar floating around in their blood, right? These are all things that are objective and observable and or measurable. Okay. Now, a symptom of a disease is something that happens to the body that is subjective and not observable or measurable. And this is something like nausea, right? Being sick to your stomach is not something that anybody can observe. Nobody can measure how nauseous you are. Same thing with like a headache or body aches, any kind of body aches or pains, any type of pain, right? All of these things are things that are subjective, right? Somebody else's pain, my 7 out of 10 pain might be somebody else's 3 out of 10. These are not things that can be given a specific number. They can't be measured or observed. Okay? And then a syndrome is a specific group of signs and or symptoms characteristic of a particular disease. So what we have over here to kind of demonstrate all of those things is the influenza syndrome. So when people have influenza, there's a set of signs and symptoms that are typically associated with this type of infection. And that's how you can kind of get an idea that you might have the flu. So the influenza syndrome is this collection of signs and symptoms: cough, headache, rhinitis, sore throat, weakness, and fever. Now, some of these are signs, some of them are symptoms. I would say, so like a cough, if somebody is coughing, somebody else can see that, right? You can even count how many times per hour somebody is coughing. Is the coughing so severe that it makes your lungs retract, right? Those are things that somebody else can see and observe. This isn't subjective. It is an objective fact that somebody is coughing. So coughing would be a sign. Headache, on the other hand, is something that is not observable. If you tell somebody you have a headache, there's no way for them to confirm that. Not that that is any less important. It's just something that is subjective. So a headache would be a symptom. Rhinitis, which is a stuffy and runny nose. Again, if somebody is looking at you, they can see that you have a stuffy and runny nose. They can see the snot coming out of your mouth. So this would be a sign. A sore throat would be a symptom. Any kind of pain or anything like that is going to be a symptom. Weakness, again, that's going to be a symptom. That's something that you feel, not something that anybody else can really see. And then a fever is going to be a sign. That is something we can stick a thermometer in your mouth and measure your temperature. So a fever is going to be a sign. Okay. And so those are the signs and symptoms of a disease. And when we talk about particular illnesses, we will spend a fair amount of time talking about signs and symptoms of particular illnesses and how we use those signs and symptoms as a way of diagnosing those illnesses. Okay. So step 5, after the bacteria or organism has caused disease, it then has to leave the host. It has to vacate. So step 5 is vacating the host, the mechanism by which a pathogen leaves its host. And another word we use for this is portal. That's not how you spell portal. Portal of exit. Okay, like I've said before, scientists are not super creative. So we have a portal of entry where a bacteria gets into the body, right? That was step 1, exposure, portal of entry. Now, step 5, the last step, is in order to propagate itself as a species, this organism has to be able to get to a new host. It has to vacate its current host and spread its way to the next one. An organism is not considered a successful pathogen. Again, remember, try to think about this from the perspective of a pathogen, a microbe. In order to be considered successful, you have to be able to spread and infect as many hosts as possible. That is the goal of a pathogenic organism. So, in order to be considered a successful pathogen, an organism has to be able to leave its host or vacate its host and move on to another one. And most organisms leave the body through a variety of exit portals. And this can have a huge impact on the overall pathogenicity of an organism. How an organism leaves its current host and infects a new one is a huge part of how dangerous that organism is and how infective that organism is. Okay, so some of our most common portals of exit, a lot of these should be pretty intuitive, right? So coughing, sneezing, any kind of fluid, for lack of a better word, exiting your respiratory cavity is going to be a huge portal of exit, particularly for respiratory pathogens. Things like common colds, influenza, strep throat, all of that fun stuff is going to be passed through coughing, sneezing, aerosolized bacteria or viruses going into the air and then going into somebody else's respiratory cavity. Urine and feces are other big ones, particularly feces. Feces is a huge portal of exit for a lot of organisms. A lot of diseases are spread through what we call the fecal-oral route, meaning that feces from one person manages to get into another person. This is why it's really important to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. But feces is a huge portal of exit. A lot of illnesses and diseases that occur in humans occur through the fecal-oral route. And again, we're going to talk a lot more about specific portals of exit and entry when we talk about particular illnesses. And these are the types of things that you will have to know. Blood is another huge portal of exit. Not just, this one shows, removal of blood, like through needles. So like sharing needles can be an important way that diseases are spread from person to person. But just being exposed to somebody else's blood, right? If somebody is bleeding, or if you have like a needle stick, I guess that's kind of related to removal of blood. But being exposed to blood of any person can spread illnesses. A lot of illnesses are contained, especially viruses, are contained within the bloodstream. They're floating in the bloodstream of the person that they are infecting, and taking blood from one person and exposing it to blood of another person can get that second person sick. Insect bites are kind of related to the same thing, because insects bite one person, they suck their blood, right? And so their blood and whatever's in their blood gets into this insect, and then this insect moves on and bites somebody else, and whatever they picked up from that first person is now being exposed to that second person. So that's kind of another way of moving blood from person to person. So like I said before, you don't have to memorize any of these specific ones right now. We're going to talk a lot about different portals of exit when we get to particular illnesses. And it is something that you'll have to know about a lot of those. Portals of exit and entry of different bacterial infections, I think is actually really interesting, because a lot of them are very unusual and somehow you wouldn't expect them. And so when we get to all the diseases in the fourth section, if you can't tell, that's my favorite section. I think it's the coolest part. We'll talk more about the particulars of vacating the host. But that is the last step in infection. All right. Okay, so now that we've talked about the stages, right, step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we are going to talk about how this disease, so instead of looking at it from the perspective of the microbe, right, we looked at it from the microbe first, what this microbe has to do in order to cause disease, right? It has to gain entry through a portal of entry. It has to adhere or stick. It has to survive the host defenses, and then it has to cause disease, and then it has to vacate the host. Those are the 5 steps of bacterial pathogenesis. Now we kind of want to shift and look at this in terms of what is happening inside of a human body. So that is what this is. This is a disease progression as it's broken down into 5 stages. And this is just kind of a generic look at what happens in a human being when they are infected with some type of microbe. So this is periods of infectious disease, particularly, because we're looking at what happens when a microbe infects a human body. And what we're looking at here, just in terms of our axes and what our graph is showing, is along the x-axis, we're looking at the passage of time. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at the intensity of signs and symptoms, not just symptoms. So the intensity of signs and symptoms. Okay, so our first step is not really a step, but they're right here is where we have that initial exposure to a microbe. And I'm also going to relate this to the steps of bacterial pathogenesis. So if we're looking at the steps of bacterial pathogenesis, this is step 1. Right? Exposure. Initial exposure to a microbe. So this is the point in the disease where this human host comes in contact with this bacteria or microbe, whatever it is. This is where this microbe is coming in contact with the portal of entry that it needs to gain access to the human body, whatever that is. So this is step 1, exposure, initial exposure to the microbe. Now this first stage, so when we're talking about periods of disease, this is actually the first stage of the period of disease. And the first period is the incubation period. Now notice that during this incubation period, there are no signs and symptoms. So when we're looking at the intensity of signs and symptoms, this stays completely flat. This is the initial stage of an infection where the bacteria have not actually set up shop yet. They haven't gained access to the host enough in order to cause disease or any types of signs and symptoms. So this, if we're looking at the stages of bacterial pathogenesis, are stages 2 and 3 of bacterial pathogenesis. So this is where adhesion and surviving the host defenses is occurring. So at this point, the bacteria or the virus is working on invading this human, right? They have been exposed in this first part, and now they are working on this bacteria or virus is inside the human body. It has been exposed to it. It has stuck to it. And now it's working on sticking and getting past those host defenses so it can get to the place where it needs to go to cause disease. So during this incubation period, if we're looking at it from the perspective of the human will have typically no idea that they're sick or that they have been exposed. This incubation period is a time where you have no signs or symptoms. The bacteria or virus is just silently doing their work inside of your body. They're working on adhesion and surviving those host defenses. Okay, so our next stage is this prodromal stage. And during this prodromal stage down here, step 2, prodromal phase, this is right at the beginning of an infection. So this is going to be kind of step 4. This is all step 4 of bacterial pathogenesis, the causing disease. But this prodromal period or prodromal stage is when the bacteria or virus has just begun to cause disease or just begun to cause symptoms. It typically lasts a relatively short amount of time. As you can see here, it's relatively short. And in this stage, during the prodromal stage, signs and symptoms, so S&S, signs and symptoms, are typically mild and non-specific. So this is that period of time, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, like right before, like think back to the last time you had a cold or the flu or something like that. For a lot of us, it was, a month ago in December. But think about the last time you had any kind of cold or anything like that. Now think about the night before you knew you were sick. A lot of times, right before you experience really intense symptoms, you experience these mild discomforts. Like you're like, I have like a weird little scratch in my throat, or I'm really, really tired tonight. I don't know why, or I just don't really feel like eating. Or maybe you're starting to get a little bit achy, or a lot of times you just don't feel quite right. You may not be able to put your finger on it, but a lot of times you can feel something kind of brewing. And that's what we mean by mild and non-specific symptoms. That's when the symptoms are not very strong, they're not very intense. Usually you can go about your day, they're not bad enough that you feel like you need to stay in bed or anything like that. And they are pretty non-specific, meaning that you can't associate them with a specific syndrome. I have a scratch in my throat. Well, that could be anything from I'm getting the flu, or I'm getting strep, or I'm getting a cold, or I have allergies, or I haven't changed my air filter, or the weather's changing, right? It could be a lot of different things. There's nothing that is specifically pointing to a particular illness. Okay, so that is the prodromal stage. Now, the next stage is the height of the infection. We call it the acute phase. And the acute phase is when this disease is really rocking, I guess. It's the period of illness or the acute phase. It's when signs and symptoms are, it's when signs and symptoms are most severe. And specific to the syndrome. So whatever syndrome you have. If you have the flu, this is when your symptoms will start to pop up where you have like a really high fever. You have the typical body aches associated with the flu. You're really tired. You have a cough associated with the flu, right? All of these signs and symptoms that point to a specific syndrome. If you have strep throat, this is when your throat goes from being like a mild, I kind of got like a weird scratch in my throat, to my throat is on fire and it's red and swollen and my lymph nodes are swollen and I have a fever, right? So these are the very intense and specific symptoms associated with whichever illness you have. Okay. And then next we have the next stage, the fourth stage, is the convalescent period. And this is when the immune system has started to take over. And the human's immune system is basically killing the microbe, whatever that microbe is. It's when your immune system or the drugs that you're taking start to combat whatever illness you have. So your signs and symptoms are going to decrease. The pathogen particles begin to die as the immune system destroys them. Signs and symptoms decline. Yeah, and so this is when, as the human host, this is when you are going to start to get better. Your immune system is officially kicking in and it's taking over whatever bacteria you had. And then the last stage is something that only happens sometimes. Okay, this is not something that happens every time. This is a sometimes thing. And that last one is the continuation period. And this is something that happens when an illness becomes chronic, meaning that it lasts a long time and that there is a long-term damage. Now, some illnesses do this, some don't. Some illnesses don't have a continuation period at all. Most of the time, if you have strep throat, right, you have strep throat, you have a sore throat, you take antibiotics, and you get better. And there is no continuation period. The same thing goes for like COVID. Most people who get COVID, they have a fever, they have a headache, they have a cough, whatever they have. They get better 5 to 10 days later, and then they have no more symptoms. But there are some people who have what's called long COVID, where the disease was so severe in them that it caused permanent damage. And they have some amount of signs and symptoms that are basically never going to go away. Some illnesses can cause permanent nerve damage that never goes away, right? Tetanus is something that can infect your spinal cord and can cause permanent nerve damage. Some illnesses cause permanent organ damage, all kinds of different things. And that's the continuation period. It's where the disease, if it has caused long-term issues, will continue on. Okay. And again, not all illnesses can do that, and we will talk specifically about some that are capable of that later. Now, something else I want to talk about is something called a secondary infection. And I'm going to add another big blank page. So, a secondary infection is something that happens after an initial infection. Okay, so this is as you can probably tell by the word secondary infection, it's a second infection that happens because of the first. Because of another infection. So a really great example of this and something that happens a lot is pneumonia after the flu. So it is really common. This happened to my son last winter. And it's really, really common that when somebody has influenza, they'll have influenza, right? They have the influenza virus. They get a cough and a fever and a body aches and all of those things associated with the flu. But as the flu is kind of exiting their body, because their body is kind of tired out and a lot of other reasons, that person can get a secondary infection. Because the lungs are kind of damaged from that initial influenza infection, that can allow bacteria to get into the lungs and cause a secondary pneumonia. And this happens to a lot of people, and a lot of times secondary infections are actually the most dangerous part. This is what happened during COVID. I know a lot of you were very young during that, but during COVID, it wasn't necessarily the COVID that was killing people. It was the secondary pneumonia or the secondary heart failure. There were a lot of people who got COVID who then, after they got better after the COVID, they had heart infections or they had lung infections or they had blood infections. Okay, and so a lot of times those secondary infections can be the most dangerous. And I want to point out on this part that you are most at risk for secondary infections when the immune system is basically distracted, I guess is a good way of putting it. We'll talk more about this when we get to the immune system. I know I keep saying that. But you are most at risk for secondary infections when your immune system is distracted by the first infection. So what I mean by that is during this convalescent phase, during this convalescent period, your immune system is working overdrive to try to get rid of whatever is making you sick. Okay, all of your resources, right? You only have so many resources and so many nutrients and so many things available inside of your body. Only have so many white blood cells and antibodies, which we'll talk more about later. And if all of your resources, all of your nutrients, and all of your energy are going to getting rid of whatever is making you sick, because that is the biggest problem, it is really, really likely that you are going to then get a secondary infection at that time, because the second infection, whatever it is able to slip past your immune system much more easily. And so this is why, if you ever think about, again, I know a lot of you were pretty young during COVID, but if you knew anybody that got really sick from COVID, the way the progression with COVID would go, especially in those early days, is somebody would get sick with COVID. They would have a really high fever. They'd have GI symptoms, whatever it was. They'd be really, really sick for like 4 or 5 days. They felt worse than they'd ever felt in their life. They were really, really sick. But then after about 4 or 5 days, they would start to get better. Okay, so that was where they were, they went through their incubation period. I'm trying to decide what color to use, sorry. They went through their incubation period. They went through the prodromal stage. They got incredibly sick. They had a high fever for 5 days. They had crazy diarrhea, all kinds of different stuff. And then after about 5 days, their fever broke and they started to feel better. And they turned the corner. They thought they were getting better. They felt great. They finally felt like themselves a little bit. A lot of people would say, I finally got up and ate something. I was starting to feel like myself again. Like I had turned the corner. My fever was gone, much, much better. And then this is when somebody would end up in the hospital. It was after they started to feel better. It was after they thought that they had started to kick the disease and things were getting better, that they would suddenly wake up unable to breathe. Okay. And that was because they had developed secondary pneumonia from the COVID. And that was because, their immune system was distracted trying to get rid of this, initial COVID. And because their body was working so hard trying to get rid of that initial COVID, the pneumonia was able to sneak under the radar and cause a lung infection. And that was the most dangerous part of COVID, was this secondary infection. Most people who got really, really sick and most people who died from COVID died because of those secondary infections. And the story was almost always the same, that they had been sick for like 4 or 5 days. They started to get better, and then all of a sudden they couldn't breathe, and they just went downhill incredibly quickly. So you're most at risk for secondary infections in that convalescent period. Once you start to get better, your immune system is working so hard to get rid of the first infection that a second one can sneak in. All right, so now we're going to talk about disease transmission, which has to do with kind of those portals of exit and portals of entry. It's basically how a disease gets from one host to another, specifically in our case, one person to another. And so the first thing we have to talk about is something called a reservoir. And a reservoir is the primary habitat of a potential pathogen. So what I mean by primary habitat is it's where it lives the most. Where it lives most often. Okay. The the primary habitat of a potential pathogen. And you can have living reservoirs, non-living reservoirs. It is possible for a living reservoir to be a human. There are diseases like influenza is one of them. Oops, that's not how you spell that. Influenza is one of them. Strep is another one. Where humans are the reservoirs. Influenza and streptococcus and staphylococcus, even things like that, their most primary habitat is a human. So they get passed from human to human, and that is how they live. They survive by moving from human to human. That is their most primary habitat. Okay, and this has to go kind of along with endogenous and exogenous, that if you get, it is possible for a reservoir to be a human, and you can get illnesses endogenously. You can get an illness from something that is already living inside your body. So it is possible for a human to be a reservoir. There are a lot of illnesses where the primary habitat of a potential pathogen is a human, and the way that we get these illnesses is by passing them from human to human. Obviously, it's very possible for a living reservoir to be a bird, a mammal, or a reptile. And these types of infections where the primary reservoir is an animal, a non-insect animal. I know that insects are technically animals, but we just kind of don't include them in this group. This type is called a zoonotic infection, because the primary reservoir is a non-human animal. So things like rabies is a zoonotic infection, because if you think about humans, we humans get rabies because of animal bites, right? We get them from typically other mammals, raccoons, possums, things like that. You can get them from cats, dogs. Those are animals, non-human and non-insect animals. Okay, so birds, mammals, reptiles, there's all kinds of different illnesses. Hantavirus, the Black Plague is typically spread through rodents, things like that, rodents, birds. Anthrax is spread through cattle, things like that. There's a lot of illnesses that come from pork. There's a lot of infections that you can get from cats, dogs, things like that. So anything that is the primary reservoir is a bird, a mammal, a non-human mammal, or a reptile, we call that a zoonotic infection. And then one of the more common living reservoir are insects. So things that are spread through mosquitoes, ticks, other types of insects, tsetse flies, right? There are all kinds of diseases that we can pick up from insects, and the primary reservoir of those diseases are the insects themselves. That's where they live most of the time. Okay, and then you can also have non-living reservoirs. There are illnesses that we get from soil or water. Soil, we'll talk about tetanus a lot, but tetanus is something that you get from the soil. Tetanus is not really spread from person to person. It's not spread through animals. You get tetanus by stepping on a rusty nail outside, right? Tetanus is spread through soil. Tetanus lives in the dirt. And that's how it's spread, is through the soil. So its reservoir is soil. There are lots of bacteria whose primary habitat is just fresh water. And there's a lot of diseases that we get that way from drinking fresh water. So a reservoir is the primary habitat of a potential pathogen. And the way that we get these illnesses is when these illnesses are capable of moving from their primary habitat into us or into a different part of us. And so we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But it's kind of an exception. It's not really an exception. It's just kind of a particular case of something that can happen in humans particularly is something called carrier state. And what carrier state is is when a pathogenic bacterium is part of a human's microbiome. And this is something that happens relatively rarely. It doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen. And what's happening in this case is it doesn't cause the host harm, right? So this host, for some reason, is unaffected by this pathogenic bacteria. And we're going to talk about one of the most famous examples in just a second. It doesn't cause the host any harm, but it can be passed to other humans. So one of the most famous cases of this, I'll talk about this one in a minute, but one of the most famous cases of this is through something called Typhoid Mary. And Typhoid Mary was a woman who lived, I don't know exactly when she lived. I want to say it was like the late 1800s. I'm in my office, so I can look this up really fast. But I believe it was the late 1800s. Sorry, I thought I could look it up really fast. My phone's being slow. Okay, I believe it was the late 1800s. It doesn't really matter. But Typhoid Mary was a real person who actually lived, and she was in a carrier state of something called Salmonella typhi. She was a carrier of Salmonella typhi, and Salmonella typhi caused the disease typhoid fever. Now, typhoid fever is a particularly dangerous gastrointestinal infection. It can be really serious. It causes death, and it used to cause death a lot more before we had antibiotics. So in the late 1800s, before antibiotics existed, Salmonella typhi was incredibly dangerous, and it absolutely killed thousands and thousands of people each year. Now, Typhoid Mary was an extreme carrier state case where she was never affected by the Salmonella typhi. And just whatever coincidences that can exist in the world, and there's no way to know why she wasn't affected by it. But she carried Salmonella typhi inside of her gastrointestinal tract. It lived inside of her gastrointestinal tract as part of her human microbiome, and it caused her absolutely no problems. Now, the issue became when she spread it to other people. Now, again, remember this was, I believe, the late 1800s. This was before antibiotics existed. This was before hand washing was a big deal. They might have started using hand washing in like doctor's offices and surgical suites, but hand washing at home absolutely was not a thing. And Typhoid Mary was actually a cook. So she would cook people's food. She worked in households, and she would cook people's food, and she spread typhoid fever to dozens and dozens and dozens of other people. In fact, she would work in households, and the entire household would get sick with typhoid fever, and many of them would die because it was an incredibly dangerous illness at the time. And when the entire family died, Typhoid Mary would just move on to somewhere else, which seems really, really callous. But you have to try to remember that at the time, the idea that she was passing something on to somebody else that wasn't causing her any problems was absolutely ridiculous. She thought everybody was lying to her, that it was her fault. And the government actually tried to, she was arrested at one point for spreading this. But they had to let her go, and they tried to tell her that you can't be a cook, you have to do something else because you're spreading this to all these people. And she refused to listen. She kept working as a cook. She kept spreading it to other people. She kept killing people because she just didn't believe that she could be spreading something that wasn't causing her any problems. So that's the story of Typhoid Mary. She spread typhoid fever to dozens and dozens and dozens of people and refused to believe that she was causing all of these people to die. And, this would be less of a problem in today's world if somebody was washing their hands after they went to the bathroom or taking proper precautions. But at the time, that wasn't a thing. And so all of typhoid fever was spread through the food she cooked because she would go to the bathroom. They didn't wash their hands at the time, and all of that bacteria would end up in the food that she was cooking. Another example of carrier state that can happen is this bacteria right here. It's called Neisseria meningitidis. And Neisseria meningitidis is a bacteria that causes meningitis, which is a brain infection. And I believe we've talked about this before. I can't remember. But it causes meningitis, which is a brain infection. Now, there are estimates that up to 10 to 20% of the population actually has Neisseria meningitidis in their respiratory cavities, so in their mouths and throats. And it doesn't cause them any problems. It lives as part of their microbiome. They have no issues with it. However, if their respiratory tract is exposed to somebody who has never come in contact with this Neisseria meningitidis, they can then pass that infection on to that second host. And so this typically happens at a time in people's lives. I believe we have talked about this, but this happens at a time in people's lives when they are suddenly coming in close contact with the respiratory tracts of people that they haven't been around before. So this usually happens in young adults. This can happen to particularly college kids or college-aged kids. Sorry for calling you kids, but college-aged people. Because this is about the time when people move out of their houses. They move out of where they have spent most of their lives. They move into dorm rooms. And suddenly they are swapping spit with each other, right? When a kid becomes young adult age is when they're experimenting physically with other people around them. And the bacteria that has been in one person's respiratory tract their whole life and has never caused them to have any problems can make somebody that they're kissing really, really sick, which is a scary thing, but it is incredibly rare for that type of infection to happen. But that is another way that carrier state can happen. And carrier state is something that can happen transiently or chronically. So transient means that it becomes part of the microbiome and then leaves quickly. Or it can be a chronic condition where this bacteria will stay long term. So Typhoid Mary, she spread typhoid for years and years and years and years. That was a chronic condition. She was chronically colonized with Salmonella typhi, and she spread it to dozens of people over many, many years. It can also be something that happens really, really quickly. So she was an example of a chronic carrier state. It can also happen really quickly. I have an example of when my son was probably, I want to say it was close to when he was like 1. It was right around his first birthday, because my son's birthday is right after Thanksgiving. And I remember that my in-laws were in town for Thanksgiving. So it was probably right around my son's first birthday. And there had been a stomach bug going around my son's school. And he was in daycare at the time. And he never had any symptoms, not a one. He didn't have weird diapers or anything. He had no symptoms. But he got everybody in our household sick with a stomach bug. So it was me and my husband and my in-laws and my brothers-in-law, my brother-in-law's girlfriend, right? We all got a stomach virus. We called him Typhoid Felix for weeks because he never had any symptoms, but he managed to spread it to all of us, right? But that was something that left very quickly. He was transiently exposed to this virus, whatever it was that made us all sick. It didn't harm him, but he sure as heck carried it to the rest of us. So he was a transient carrier. That's not something that still happens. It's not like he's out there passing stomach bugs to everybody he's around. It was something that was over very quickly. And that happens more commonly than we might think, right? If you've ever been the only person in your household that didn't get the flu, or the only person in your household that didn't get COVID, it's possible that you were exposed. You just didn't get symptoms because you became a carrier. So it's something that can happen quickly, transiently, or something that can happen chronically. All right, so transmission of an illness is a huge part of how a bacteria or virus causes a disease. It's the method by which a microbe is moved from one host to another, or one host to another, or reservoir to host. So what I mean by that is moving from the primary reservoir, like an animal or an insect or something like that, to a host. It's how this microbe moves to cause infection somewhere else. And this can happen, again, a lot of this should be pretty intuitive. It can happen directly or indirectly. So direct contact would be like direct contact, right? So direct physical contact, shaking hands, kissing, hugging. You can get this through, any type of direct physical contact where you are touching somebody else, or by air. If you sneeze in somebody's face, that is considered direct contact, right? Influenza is capable of moving from one person's face to another person's face through coughing and sneezing. Things like herpes and gonorrhea, right? Those happen through direct sexual contact. So those are also directly exchanged. Transmission can also happen indirectly. Okay, so that can happen because somebody with the flu touched a doorknob, and then you came behind them and touched the same doorknob and then touched your own face. Okay, so that's like indirect. Or, I think I said last time, like I got cold sores because I stole my brother's soda when I was a kid. So he didn't directly give me cold sores. He took a drink of a soda, put the virus on that soda can. I came up behind him and took a drink of it. That is indirect transmission. It happened through a soda can. Happened through cups, door handles, all kinds of different stuff. It can also happen through food. So a lot of ways that food is a kind of an indirect mover of bacteria is, again, like the case of Typhoid Mary. So that bacteria lived in her gastrointestinal tract. She would go to the bathroom, clean herself, and some of that bacteria that was in her feces would end up on her hands. And then she would cook food that, using her hands, she would touch vegetables, things like that. And then the other people would eat that food that had been contaminated with bacteria. So that is an indirect transmission. It wasn't going directly from host to host. There was an indirect object in between the transmission. You can also get food and water, I would say, also counts. There are a lot of cases of people getting illnesses because they drink contaminated water, right? And so that happens. An animal somewhere defecates into a water source, and then somebody goes to that water source and drinks the water. That is an indirect bacterial transmission. And then the last way is through vector. And a vector means either some type of animal or some type of insect. So an insect bite is a type of vector. A rabid animal, an animal that bites you. Okay, so usually we think of vectors as living things and indirect as non-living. So, if something passes through food or by a handle or a cup or something like that, that is indirect transmission because it's through something that is non-living, right? The transmission chain there was person, cup, other person. The in-between, the go-between, is something that is not alive. It's a cup. But if we're going from person to mosquito, to other person. That is vector transmission, because the in-between is a mosquito, something that is living. Okay. Now, transmission of illnesses, diseases, particularly infectious diseases, can be communicable or non-communicable. Another word for this that we kind of use is contagious or not contagious. That doesn't exactly translate, but communicable means that it is something that can be spread person to person, either directly, indirectly, or through a vector. Okay, so most of the diseases that you are thinking about, like if I ask you to think about an infectious disease, and remember, we're only talking about infectious diseases here, you are probably thinking of communicable diseases, something that can be spread from person to person at all, right? This is not something that can be qualified. It's just, does it or does it not? Is it capable of being spread from person to person? Does it spread through direct contact or by food or by water or through an insect or through a rabid animal? That is being transmitted from person to person. Something that is non-communicable is just the opposite. It is not transmitted person to person. And there are not nearly as many examples of this. The best example of this, again, is tetanus. Tetanus, you could be living and sleeping in the same bed as somebody who has tetanus, and you will never get tetanus. Okay, it is not spread from person to person. It is spread through soil. The only way you are getting tetanus is if you step on something or cut yourself or something like that. We'll talk more about tetanus later. But if you step on a rusty nail outside, that's why when you cut yourself on a chain link fence or hurt yourself doing farm work or something like that, you have to get a tetanus shot. Tetanus, the only time you are at risk for tetanus is when you have an open wound that is exposed to soil. Like I said, you can be regularly having physical contact, you can be regularly having sex with somebody who has tetanus, and you are never going to catch it. That is not how tetanus is spread. Tetanus is not spread person to person. It is non-communicable. Okay. All right. And so kind of another special case is something called a healthcare associated infection. And healthcare associated infections, also known as HAIs, are infectious diseases that occur as a direct result of a stay in a hospital or healthcare facility. And so this is a special case of communicable illness. So these are communicable illnesses. They're ones that can be spread from person to person. But these are just kind of a special subset of those communicable illnesses that occur as a direct result of a stay in a hospital or healthcare facility. And we don't have to necessarily know a lot about what's on this slide. I think it's just interesting or important to think about. And I looked these numbers up. This was in 2024. So I don't have the updated numbers for 2025 yet, but in 2024, there were approximately 1.7 million infections and 99,000 deaths, so almost 100,000 deaths in the US alone as a direct result of staying in a hospital. Which, I mean, makes sense. Hospitals, people go to the hospital because they're sick. So of course, being in a hospital makes you more likely to get an infection. But that's a huge number. Almost 2 million infections. Think about the amount of money that costs to treat people with 2 million extra infections and almost 100,000 deaths. There's 100,000 people dying because they had to go to the hospital for something and ended up with something else. And this was a chart that was in your book that I thought was really interesting. And this chart shows that in recent years, they've actually put a lot of emphasis, and if you guys all go into nursing or any kind of healthcare field, I think that this becomes a large part of your training, is that between 2015-ish and 2019-ish, they put a lot of policies in place in a lot of hospitals to specifically try to decrease the number of healthcare associated infections. And a lot of those kind of policies and procedures that were put in place to do this are actually really, really successful, or have been successful. You can see that C. diff, which we're going to talk more about in just a second, but C. diff infections are down 42% in just 4 years, which is really incredible. Almost cut in half in just 4 years. So the only point to this is just to understand the definition of what a healthcare associated illness is, and to just have an idea of the impact that can have on healthcare in general. Most of you, again, want to go into healthcare. And so it's important that you realize that this is an issue, and it's something that you'll have to spend a lot of time trying to combat. There are a lot of policies that are pretty new, and I'm sure that there will be lots of policies going forward to try to combat these healthcare associated infections. Okay. And now we want to talk mostly briefly, about something called epidemiology. And what epidemiology is, we have a couple of slides on this. Epidemiology is a science. Okay? When you put ology at the end of everything, it is a science. And epidemiology is a science, or the study of the frequency and distribution of disease. So basically, how diseases are transmitted. How easily they are transmitted, where they are transmitted. Are they transmitted from person to person? Are they transmitted directly or indirectly? How well are they able to be transmitted? How often does that happen? Right? This is an incredibly detailed and complicated science. There's a lot of factors that go into this study, right? There are whole doctors and scientists who spend their entire life looking at epidemiology. And we're just going to cover it very, very briefly. But one of the most important things that they study in epidemiology is something called the reproductive rate, which we will call, and this R with a little 0 on the bottom, when you say that out loud, you say R naught. Okay, so it's R NAUGHT, R naught. And that's that R0. That's what it sounds like when you say it out loud. And this R naught is the reproductive rate of an organism. And what this kind of equates to is if one person has this illness, how many other people will they spread it to? So the reproductive rate is roughly equivalent to the number of people one sick person will spread the illness to. On average. Okay, so that is the reproductive rate. And again, a lot of things go into the calculation of the reproductive rate, how infective something is, how virulent something is, vaccination rates, and all of these things. We'll talk about more about it in a second. But the reproductive rate is, on average, the number of people one sick person will spread the illness to. Now, if we look at this chart over here, you'll also note that R naughts assumes a fully susceptible population. And what I mean by that is there is no vaccines and no immunity. We'll talk more about immunity in just a second. But this is assuming everybody in the population is capable of getting that illness. There's been no vaccination, no other illness, there's been no immunity given to this population. Okay, so assuming a base population of completely susceptible people, people that are capable of getting this illness. This is just some examples of some R naughts. So possibly one of the most prolific illnesses in the world is the measles. And the measles has an R naught of 15. And what that means is for every person that has the measles and is infected with the measles, they will, on average, get 15 other people sick, assuming that there's no vaccination and that they are coming in regular contact with the people around them. So this is, somebody who has a job and sees other people, interacts with kids, whatever else. So the measles has an R naught of 15. One person can get 15 other people sick. Okay. To put that in perspective, most people who get influenza will only give it on average to 1.3 other people. The original COVID strain has an R naught of about 3. So one person will get about 3 other people sick. So that's a huge difference between COVID and measles. And if you want to look at this in terms of which one is the most infective, because you can kind of relate this reproductive rate to infectivity, because infectivity is how capable this organism is of spreading. So an organism that has an incredibly high reproductive rate is going to be more infective or more contagious, if you want to think about it that way. And the seasonal influenza, which has a lower reproductive rate, will be less infective. Okay? And then the other ones will all kind of be in between. Okay, so we're not going to talk about how we calculate reproductive rates. You don't even have to memorize these numbers. But what you do have to remember is that what that basic definition is so a reproductive rate of 15 means that on average, one sick person will get 15 other people sick, and that a higher reproductive rate means that it is more infective. So the measles with an R naught of 15 is more infective than influenza, which has an R naught of 1.3, which should make sense. Again, on average, more people will get sick from the measles than influenza. So the measles is more infective. Okay. And then the next part of epidemiology, and the last thing we'll kind of talk about in epidemiology, is something called herd immunity. And herd immunity occurs when a significant portion of a population becomes immune to a disease. And why that's important, we'll talk more about in a second. But what do we mean by becomes immune? Well, immune means that typically you can't get the infection. We'll talk more about how that happens when we get to the immune system. But typically when you are immune to an infection, it means that your body has defenses set up so that that disease cannot infect you. That disease cannot get inside your body, and it is not going to make you sick. Your immune system is set up to kill it before it can hurt you. Okay? And there are two major ways to become immune to a disease. The first one is by getting the disease in the first place. This is why people who, when you get sick, your body creates these defenses so that you do not get sick again. Again, we'll talk more about this in a little while, a couple of chapters. But getting the disease usually creates immunity. So this is why people who had the chicken pox, I know most of you don't get the chicken pox anymore, but when I was a kid, we all got the chicken pox. And so because I had chicken pox as a kid, I am now immune to chicken pox. Typically, people will not get an infection a second time unless the virus or bacteria mutates, which is usually what happens with like the flu. Like you can get the flu more than once in your life. And that's because there are dozens of different flu strains and the viruses are different from each other. But you cannot get the same illness twice if you have a functioning immune system. Most typical people will only get sick once. So one way to become immune is to get the disease. And the other way to become immune is to become vaccinated. And we'll talk again what being vaccinated has to do with the immunity later. We'll talk about how that works in specific, but vaccination is another way to make yourself immune without having to get sick first. It's basically tricking your body into making you immune. So what happens when we have herd immunity? So if only a few people are vaccinated or immune, okay, so vaccinated, they have vaccinated written here, but really what they mean is immune. If only a few people are immune, so in this case, the blue people are the ones that are vaccinated or immune. But in this one over here, this diagram, all of these gray people are people that are susceptible to this infection. They are not immune and they can get sick. So if only a few people are vaccinated or immune, this one sick yellow person right here can spread that illness to almost everybody else because everybody surrounding them is susceptible. Okay, so all the people that are gray can get this infection. And what will eventually happen is that infection will spread very, very fast because there are a high percentage of the population is capable of getting sick. But if lots of people are immune, vaccinated, or immune, if one person gets sick, this person right here, it may spread to one or two people, but most of the people surrounding them are immune and they can't get it. Okay, so and arguably the most important part of this is not the people who are vaccinated, though that is incredibly important. If I'm vaccinated, I would really like to not get an illness. But these people over here, like this gray person right here, maybe they can't get vaccinated. Maybe they're too young, right? Like MMR vaccines, you can't get until you're a few months old. I don't remember exactly. There's a lot of vaccines that you can't get until you're at least a year old. And so maybe you can't get vaccinated. Maybe you can't get vaccinated because you have cancer or an autoimmune disease, or you're too young, you're a baby, or you're too old. You know, as you get older, your immune system starts to take a hit and it can be difficult to get vaccinated when you're older. Maybe you're allergic to the ingredients. But this one gray person over here that can't get vaccinated, they are unlikely to get sick because everybody around them is immune. And so the chance of the disease spreading is decreased so much that most of the people in the population are protected. And that's what we mean by herd immunity. It's that enough people in the population are protected, are immune, so that the whole herd is immune or the whole herd is protected. It keeps the disease more contained. Okay. And that's what we mean by herd immunity. And the level at which herd immunity occurs is going to be different for each and every infection. So we're going to talk about a specific case of herd immunity right now and what that level looks like. So this is a chart that shows measles cases and MMR vaccination rates in the United States. So these numbers are only in the US, so just keep that in mind. And MMR stands for measles, mumps, rubella. So MMR vaccination is the vaccine is protection against 3 different diseases: measles, mumps, and rubella. Measles being one of them. We're only going to talk about measles. So there's a lot going on in this chart. But what I want to focus on, what we have going across the bottom is the year. And what we have going across this axis over here is the MMR rate. So this is the vaccination rate, the percentage of vaccination in the United States as a whole. Okay, so this is just looking at the entire United States. So this 0.91 is 91%, if you don't know that. And this 0.96 is 96%. Now, the other important piece of information here is that for herd immunity to be active with the MMR vaccine, herd immunity, and remember, this number is going to be different for each and every disease and vaccine, but for herd immunity to work for MMR, it's required to have an approximately 95% vaccination rate. Now, before 2011, the vaccination rates were well over 95%. They were approaching 100%. And the number of measles cases was basically immeasurable. The number of measles cases that we had in the US was nearly zero for a long time. It was considered eliminated in the 90s, which isn't quite eradicated. It still existed, but there were so few cases that it was almost eradicated. So before 2011, the vaccination rates were well above 95%, and the number of measles cases was basically zero. So, but what we're looking at, so this is that 95%. Okay, so what we're looking at in blue here, we have the number of measles cases per year. Okay, so something that happened in approximately 2018 is there was a study, there's a lot of things that have gone on, but there was a study in the late 90s, early 2000s that linked the MMR vaccine to autism. It was disproven a long time ago. There has never been any evidence that the MMR vaccine was linked to autism. That paper was actually proven to be a complete lie. The person who wrote it made it up. But a lot of people put a lot of stock in that research paper. And so there was a lot of distrust when it came to these MMR vaccines. So after 2011, the amount of vaccination decreased. And so what I want you to look at first is notice this. I'm going to change the color. Notice this year right here. This year, there was a significant dip. In 2018, there was a significant dip in the number of vaccines, right? It dropped below this 95% threshold. And then in 2019, there was a huge jump in the number of measles cases because these vaccination rates went down. They dropped below 95%. The country no longer had herd immunity, and the number of measles cases jumped significantly. Now, the next year, there was an increase in the number of vaccines, right? The number of vaccines, the mean MMR rate went over this 95% threshold. And then the next year, there was a record low number of measles cases. Now, this probably also had something to do with the fact that it was 2020 and people were not going outside, right? That was during COVID. So that probably played a role in that too. But what I more want to focus on is what's happening currently. And I understand that this is kind of a hot topic. A lot of people are going to disagree with me on this. And I truly stand by the fact that I think that vaccines are personal choice. However, I think that something that also happens in our society is that we are not necessarily given all of the truth. And so my goal with this is to give you facts and to tell you all of the things that are true, both good and bad, so that when you are making these types of choices moving forward, you have all of the information, not the information that makes it look like there's no downside to not getting vaccinated. Like I said, I understand this is a hot topic. Measles right now in the United States is a huge mess, and a lot of people have very strong feelings about it on both sides. My goal is not to necessarily try to convince you to get vaccinated if you're not, or to vaccinate your children in a few years when it's, your time to do that. But just to give you all of the information. If you want to come to my office and talk to me more about this, you're welcome to. We can have a nice, heated, respectful argument about it. But my goal here is to just give you as much information as possible. Okay, so what is happening currently is after 2020, during COVID, there was this huge backlash to the US government. For good or for bad, it doesn't matter. But what really happened was when the COVID-19 vaccine came out, the trust in the US government and the trust of science and vaccines absolutely tanked, which I think is a weird phenomenon, and I don't know why that happened. But when this vaccine was developed, a large portion of the United States population started to distrust vaccines in general. They distrusted this COVID-19 vaccine. There was all kinds of crazy stuff going around that, things had trackers in them and all kinds of stuff. For whatever reason, the trust absolutely plummeted. And so vaccination rates from 2020 to 2024, 2025 have continued to drop. Okay, the mean and the median have continued to drop. And every year, almost every year since 2020, the number of measles cases has increased. As the amount of measles vaccines has decreased, the number of measles cases has increased, which should make sense. Because we have dropped below this 95% herd immunity. So as we've dropped below this herd immunity, the number of cases goes up. The number of people who are being exposed to the measles goes up. The number of people who are susceptible goes up every year. Okay, and so just to give you some numbers again, I looked at these numbers this morning. I looked them up. So in 2025, the entire year of 2025, the rate of the median rate, or I don't know if it was median or mode or mean, the average vaccination rate in the United States in 2025, which we'll put here, was a little less than 92%. Okay, so it dropped down below 92%, again, well below the 95% herd immunity. Now, the number of measles cases in the United States in 2025 is completely off this chart, actually. So I will draw this line over here. But the number of measles cases in the United States in 2025 was 2,242. So in 2024, we had about 300. And in 2025, we had 2,242. So far in the United States in 2026, so and I think it was as of January 13th, 2026, there have been 171 cases. So 2 weeks into 2026, there have been 171 cases. We are on track to have an increase again this year. And I want you to realize that, again, this 2,242, the top of this chart is 1,200. So we almost doubled the number of cases from our most historic year of measles. So that's a dangerous precedent to be setting. But the important thing to note here is that as the number of vaccinations go down, the number of infections goes up. As we decrease our immunity, the number of infections is going to go up. Now, just some more facts. These are not things that you have to memorize. They're just things for you to think about. These are true things to just think about. So in 2025, again, of those 2,242 cases, 245 of them, which is about 11%, were hospitalized. So we'll say 10%, we'll round down. About 10% were hospitalized, and there were 3 deaths, which is about 0.1%, right? And that's not that many deaths in terms of, the entire United States. But something to think about. So in the 1950s, before there was a vaccine, on average, 500,000 people got the measles every year. So before there was a vaccine, approximately 500,000 people got sick with the measles every year. Now, that was at a time when our population was a lot smaller. So who's to say, if measles became rampant again, what those numbers would look like. But say we multiply that out and say that we all of a sudden have 500,000 people getting sick with the measles every year. Based on these numbers, that would mean about 50,000 people in the United States alone being hospitalized with the measles and almost 1,000 deaths every year. So, those are just true statements that I know 3 deaths doesn't sound like a lot, and maybe 1,000 deaths doesn't even sound like a lot, but there was a point in time that there were 0 deaths every year from the measles. And so not getting the measles vaccines is creating deaths that didn't have to exist. Whether that's worth the risk to you to get your own vaccines is something that you have to choose. It's, again, my point is not to give it a moral stance and saying this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing. But it's something that you have to look at in reality of, a death from measles is incredibly rare. 0.1% of the people who get the measles in 2025 died from the measles. And that doesn't seem like a lot. It's an incredibly rare occurrence. Measles is usually non-fatal. Most people who get the measles have a fever and a rash for 5 days and then they're fine. But 0.1% of those people die. And 0.1% doesn't sound like that many until it's your kid or you. And so that's just something that is a reality that you have to look at and be okay with when you're making that decision. And it's important to know that the chance of that happening is not 0. And as the number of measles cases increases, that chance goes up. There was a point in time not that long ago where no people died of the measles every year. And last year, 3 people died. It's possible that given the current state of things that dozens more people are going to die this year from the measles. And those are dozens of people that didn't have to die because we have a solution to this problem. So it's just something to think about. And it's the reality of the world that we live in, for good or for bad, that people are questioning vaccines and whether they want to have them. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that it's important when you're looking at that to look at it with a true eye and not sweep under the rug the fact that it is very possible for you to die from the measles. People say, oh, well, my grandmother had the measles. Everybody used to get the measles and everybody was fine. Most people were fine, not everybody. And so those are the kinds of things that you have to think about when you're thinking about vaccines. And it can be really hard. And it's a hot topic. It's an uncomfortable topic. We're going to talk about it some more because we like to talk about uncomfortable things here. But yeah, this is a true chart. This is the true data. There's no agenda here. This is just what's happening. So just food for thought. All right, so this is the end of this video. I will also be posting another video on Monday to make up for the class that we're missing on that day. So I hope all of you stay nice and warm and get home safe. And I hope you enjoy your little break and your ice day. Hopefully our power stays on. All right, everybody stay safe.